Good morning. This will be our Sunday school study for Sunday, January 17th, 2021. Last week in chapter 29 of Genesis, we saw that Jacob was tricked into marrying Leah and then had to agree to work for Laban another 7 years in order to have Rachel, whom he had wanted to marry, as his wife also. Chapter 29 also tells us that Leah gave Jacob 4 sons and then stopped bearing children. And now at the start of chapter 30, we read this. And when Rachel saw that she bare Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said unto Jacob, Give me children, or else I die. And Jacob's anger was kindled against Rachel, and he said, Am I in God's stead, who hath withheld from thee the fruit of the womb? Women have a unique ability to give birth to children. And there was a time when this was treasured and desired, a time when the differences between men and women were valued. When I read these words from Rachel, I can't help but think of how many people today talk about unwanted pregnancies and then dispose of a child through abortion because it's inconvenient. Rachel would have been appalled by this, and so should we. At conception, there is a unique combination of 46 chromosomes immediately, and that set of 46 chromosomes that is there at conception define that individual. Everything that person will grow into is in place. Those same exact 46 chromosomes are there at birth, and when the individual turns 3 years old, or 10, or 20, or 80, a unique life begins at the moment of conception, but the world has decided it's okay to end such a life as long as it's done before birth. In contrast to many a modern person, Rachel wanted to conceive and have children. However, it must be noted that her desire was accompanied by jealousy and a lack of logic here. Jacob's rhetorical question was a good one. He had not closed her womb, and he could not open it. What we see next is reminiscent of Jacob's grandmother in verses 3 through 8. It says, And she said, Behold, my maid Bilhah, go in unto her, and she shall bear upon my knee, that I may also have children by her. And she gave him Bilhah her handmaid to wife, and Jacob went in unto her. And Bilhah conceived and bare Jacob a son. And Rachel said, God hath judged me, and hath also heard my voice, and has given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. And Bilhah, Rachel's maid, conceived again, and bare Jacob a second son. And Rachel said, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. And she called his name Naphtali. God had promised that a great nation would come from Jacob. And God would work with the mess that was now being made. Rachel claimed Bilhah's children as her own, and her reason for rejoicing is really not very attractive. It's not, I've had a child and he's healthy, and she says, With great wrestlings have I wrestled with my sister, and I have prevailed. See, it was a contest in her eyes, and not in hers alone, because we read in the following verses, When Leah saw that she had left bearing, she took Zilpah, her maid, and gave her to Jacob to wife. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a son. And Leah said, A troop cometh, and called his name Gad. And Zilpah, Leah's maid, bare Jacob a second son. And Leah said, Happy am I, for the daughter shall call me blessed. And she called his name Asher. In all of this, I feel rather sorry for Bilhah and Zilpah. They were given to be Jacob's wives, but they were not allowed to claim the children to whom they gave birth. And Jacob shows no more resistance to this whole plan than his grandfather had to the same kind of idea. To begin with, going back a ways, Jacob should not have been tricked into marrying Leah. Laban had lied to him and deceived him in that. However, Once he was married to Leah, he should have been content. He should have chosen to be content. But he wanted Rachel, and so he married her too. Uh, Rachel could have chosen to accept that God had not opened her womb, but instead she said, "Take my handmaid as a wife and father children for me through her." And apparently, Jacob must have said something like, "Yes, dear." And then, to be fair, he had to say the same thing to Leah when she made the same kind of request. What we have here is one mess heaped upon another. But despite all the human failings, God would still have his will done. So the sisters continued in their competition, and eventually we read in verses 20 through to 24, "And God remembered Rachel, and God hearkened to her, and opened her womb, and she conceived and bare a son, and said, God hath taken away my reproach. And she called his name Joseph, and said, The Lord shall add to me another son." Now, jumping a bit ahead, we know that Jacob had been blessed with much in the way of herds, and obviously he had several children. But we're going to go to chapter 31 and start right at the beginning of that. It says, "And he heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob hath taken away all that was our father's, and of that which was our father's hath he gotten all this glory. And Jacob beheld the countenance of Laban, and behold, it was not toward him as before. And the Lord said unto Jacob, Return unto the land of thy fathers, and to thy kindred, and I will be with thee." So Jacob did as the Lord said. However, it's interesting to note that Jacob had a habit of trying to control things, as he had done earlier in life with both his brother and his father. Laban agreed that when it came time for Jacob to leave, he would take all of the striped and speckled animals of the flock. And so we read in chapter 30, in verses 37 through 42, "And Jacob took him rods of green poplar, and of the hazel and chestnut tree, and pilled white strakes in them, and made the white appear which was in the rods. And he set the rods which he had pilled before the flocks in the gutters in the watering troughs when the flocks came to drink, that they should conceive when they came to drink. And the flocks conceived before the rods, and brought forth cattle, ring-straked, speckled, and spotted. And Jacob did separate the lambs, and set the faces of the flocks toward the ring-straight, and all the brown in the flock of Laban. And he put his own flocks by themselves, and put them not unto Laban's cattle. And it came to pass, whensoever the stronger cattle did conceive, that Jacob laid the rods before the eyes of the cattle and in the gutters, that they might conceive among the rods. But when the cattle were feeble, he put them not in. So the feebler were Laban's, and the stronger Jacob's." Now, from this, we see, first of all, that Jacob was a man prone to accept some superstitious ideas, as were his wives. You go back a little bit, and it talked about the mandrakes that Leah's son had found, and mandrakes were believed to increase a woman's chance of conceiving. So that's what that ties into, a superstition of the time too. But while Jacob may have thought that he had some kind of magical things going on with these rods, though he may have thought he was fooling Laban, the reality is this: God had planned to bless Jacob, and Jacob's superstitious activity really didn't mean anything. The will of God meant everything. Sometimes God blesses us in spite of our own stupidity. Once Jacob and his family and his herds had left Laban, Jacob began sending gifts ahead to his brother Esau. After all, last he had heard, Esau had wanted to kill him, and of course that was years before. So he was going to fix this as well by kind of paying Esau off and calming him down with gifts. So even while Jacob was doing God's will by returning to his homeland, he still had a tendency to think he could personally control things. And so we come to this in chapter 32. And Jacob was left alone and there wrestled a man with him until the breaking of day. And when he saw that he prevailed not against him, he touched the hollow of his thigh, and the hollow of Jacob's thigh was out of joint, and he wrestled with him. And he said, Let me go, for the day breaketh. And he said, I will not let thee go, except thou bless me. And he said unto him, What is thy name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, Thy name shall be called no more Jacob, but Israel. For as a prince hast thou power with God and men, and hast prevailed. And Jacob asked him, and said, Tell me, I pray thee, thy name. And he said, Wherefore is it that thou dost ask after my name? And he blessed him there. And Jacob called the name of the place Peniel, for I have seen God face to face, and my life is preserved. And as he passed over Peniel, the sun rose upon him, and he halted upon his thigh. From Jacob's own words, the man he wrestled with was God himself. So what does it mean to wrestle with God? Well, as we've already noted, Jacob was both obeying God and going to his homeland, and yet still trying to have control over things. Jacob hadn't needed to put the rods before the animal's eyes. He didn't really need to send gifts ahead to his brother. God had it all under control. But Jacob was somewhat in a habit of saying, I trust you, Lord, but I'm going to help you out. Clearly, he was wrestling with some things internally. And so he's given quite a lesson in this wrestling match. Jacob wanted a blessing. He asked for one. And the blessing he was given while struggling with God was a new name. See, Jacob means trickster or supplanter, while Israel means one having power as a prince with God. One important thing to get is this. While the name Israel focused on Jacob's relationship with God, it was also a reminder that while Jacob was a prince, God was still the king. And Jacob, now called Israel, was not likely to forget that, since he went forth from there limping. Now, this account took on a very personal meaning to me based on something that happened to me in the late 1990s. Now, I had been a church-going man, but I was also very much hoping to climb the corporate ladder in a management career I had with an international management company. But near the end of 1997, ironically, I fell off of a ladder, literally, and broke my right heel bone into 3 pieces, for which I required surgery. So after 3 months on disability, and now with my foot in a brace, and at the time a very noticeable limp, I went back to work, only to shortly thereafter have the company for which I worked lose its contract with the hospital we were at, and so I found myself out of a job. And everything else that happened in that year humbled me more and more. I finally came to a point where I felt so low that there was nothing to do but look up. And that's when I truly trusted in the Lord, whom I had previously really only acknowledged. The year that brought me to the Lord, it started with me breaking my foot. So every time I step down on my right foot, I feel some pain. And at this point, on bad days, I might even grab my cane and use it to help me out. But I wouldn't have it any other way, because every step I take reminds me that God is in control and that He was willing to do whatever it would take to get my attention. So when Jacob moved on the next morning after his wrestling match, he really had quite a blessing. Part of it was a new name indicating that he was a prince of God who was the king. And with that, the other part of the blessing was, with each step he took, he had a constant reminder that God was always in charge. So he would have never forgotten this. he would have remembered with every step he took that though he'd been struggling with God, God was in control all the time. And God blessed him even in spite of his own stubbornness. So I want to give you something to think about when you look at this account of Jacob. Whether you limp or not when you walk, let me encourage you to kind of have the same attitude um, of knowing with every step you take that God is in control, and know that you can and that you should trust Him in all things. Thanks for tuning in. Have a great day, and God bless you.